Well, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second webinar in our Timber and Tide series. Tonight's webinar is entitled Exploring the Salmon Habitat of Our Coastal Streams. My name is Heather Goebel, and I am the volunteer coordinator here at Seven Capes Bird Alliance. We're really excited to have so many sponsors for tonight's webinar. We've got a special thanks going out to the Oregon chapters of the Sierra Club, Wild Salmon Center, Mid-Willamette Bird Alliance, and the Coast Range Association. All of these organizations do really amazing work here on the coast, and we're really happy to be partner with them for this webinar series. I just wanted to give a quick shout out to Nissa Parker and Kent Doughty of Seven Capes. They've helped make this webinar series possible tonight. And just to let everyone know, again, this webinar format is set up so that only the panelists are visible and everyone else is muted just for the courtesy of the speakers. Following introductions, our speaker tonight, Conrad, will be speaking for about 15 minutes, and questions and answers will be following that. We should be finishing up about 7:30 tonight. And again, just as a reminder, tonight's webinar is being recorded. And just a little bit about who we are. Seven Capes Bird Alliance, formerly Lincoln City Audubon, has been serving Lincoln and Tillamook counties since about 2006. Our core programs are education, community science, and conservation action. We provide monthly bird outings and events. In our conservation focus areas right now are forest practices, rocky habitats, marine reserves, water quality, and threats to birds and wildlife, all viewed through the lens of climate change. And if you guys want to learn more about us and what we do, feel free to check out our website, sevencapes.org. And just as a little promotion for our next webinar in the series, this will be the last one, and it's going to be on February 5th. We will have Dr. Matthew Betts sharing on his managing forests for bird conservation. So really looking forward to that one. So be sure to register for that one as well. And again, registration for that one is free, just as it is for this one. Right, and before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the land we are living on here in Lincoln City. Before the period of white settlement, the land and waters we now occupy on the Oregon coast were home to the Tillamook and Alsea peoples. It is right and just to recognize these sovereign Indian nations and to remember the disposition they were forced to endure. Despite these losses, Tillamook and Alsea people continue to thrive and act collectively as part of existing confederations. As we engage with wildlife and the environment that surround us today, we pledge to learn from these nations within the Confederated Tribes of Siletz, as well as our neighbors, the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. We look forward to collaborating on all of our common goals. Now, to introduce our speaker tonight, Conrad grew up in the diverse watersheds of Oregon, quickly developed a fascination for the aquatic world that has inspired him to act on behalf of wild fish and rivers throughout his life. His interests in ecology, evolution, and the environment led him to complete a degree in biology from the University of Puget Sound in 2012. Since then, he has worked with nonprofit organizations, academic institutions, sovereign nations, and fishery consultants. And he is aiming to advance science-based management of fish restoration of watersheds through the Pacific Northwest. As a biologist the Wild Fish Conservancy, Conrad brings a policy and research background, plus experience with habitat restoration and protection. He also brings a vision for better relationships between different communities and cultures that depend on fish and rivers. Conrad lives with his wife in McMinnville, Oregon, and when not at work, he can be found foraging for wild foods or wandering in the Coast Range in a stream somewhere or in the ocean. So please help me welcome Conrad Gowell.
Thank you, everyone, and it's a pleasure to be able to join you tonight. Just want to get it okay. Everyone still hear me all right? Maybe I can get a thumbs up from my other panelists here. Is it still looking good? Great. Well, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. And the talk I wanted to give is really exploring the salmon habitat of our coastal streams. There's a lot of people that experience, what it's like to be around a watershed, but very seldomly do people get underneath the water or get to experience species working professionally in them all day. So with that, I did have a let me just make sure my slide deck is working here. There we go. I did have an acknowledgement of place and people as well. Heather did just a really lovely one. So I'll just um, touch on one thing to add in there is that sometimes I don't feel like a land acknowledgement fully captures the way in which water moves through our lives. And I wanted to make sure we included the estuarine and ocean ecosystems in those places that have been colonized and that continue to provide cultural resources and first foods, and add a few other nations in there, the Chinook Nation especially, as well as Confederated Tribes of the Siletz and Confederated Tribes of the Grand Rondes, and members of the Lower Umpqua, Coos, and Coquel. When I do land acknowledgements, they think they demand a call for action, and I encourage everyone to explore for themselves ways you can right the wrongs of history. So whenever I also do a acknowledgement, it's of place, and there's been a lot of history that's shared, and much of Western history is limited to the short time period in which we have written accounts of what happened. Some of the earliest that I found for the area of the Central Oregon coast are from Robert Haswell in 1788. He was a sailor that came from Boston to the Northwest coast in search of sea otter skins. And as far as back then, they noticed smallpox. So it was far in advance of the westward expansion by foot that many of the diseases affected the peoples of the coastal watersheds. And I think it's also important to acknowledge that species have disappeared from these areas. Sea otters, especially, there's a large number of people working on reintroductions, but it speaks to what is possible if we don't reverse the trends of what we've seen with the declines in species like salmon. So General Talbot is one of the other really well-known and one of the first overland expeditions to the Central Oregon coast, who came in 1849. And I've highlighted just a little quotation from his journal here that residents on this bay, he's talking specifically about Siletz Bay in this passage, are the last lingering remnants of a large population of people. And so these are important little bits to take into consideration as we confront problematic ideas of historical baselines, especially as they relate to narratives of pristine wilderness. So it's just something to keep in mind as I go through the rest of this talk, and we'll try and revisit that maybe one or two times. So who am I? It's always the existential question. I am someone who's loved any place a salmon can swim my entire life. And I'm someone who's also deeply concerned about the legacy that we're leaving with regards to biodiversity loss and environmental decision making. My curiosity is taking me from field camps in remote Alaska, where I studied salmon with the University of Washington. Um, there, I was able to experience what true abundance of sockeye salmon look like, where you have several million salmon, in some cases, returning to a single watershed. To coming home after having had that experience and being in the frigid waters, surveying for juvenile coho, looking at overwinter survival in the wintertime in the Oregon coastal streams. Some of you may know me from my time doing habitat restoration work for the Mid-Coast Watersheds Council that I worked at for several years, or doing grassroots organizing with the Native Fish Society. And over my career, there's 3 different listing petitions I've had to work on because of noted salmon declines in given areas. It's not something that I necessarily wanted to work on, but after going and seeing what healthy salmon populations look like, again, speaking to those shifting baselines that we have all experienced, and then coming back home and realizing not only what we've lost, but what we have to gain by restoring salmon. I wanted to dedicate my life to working on those issues. So the 3 petitions that I've been involved with in my life are petition to list the spring run Chinook of the Oregon coast. I've been a co-author on the petition to list steelhead on the Olympic Peninsula, and then the most recent, a petition to list Chinook salmon in the Gulf Coast of Alaska. For the last 5 years, I've worked for the Wild Fish Conservancy, and I often get the question, like, what do you do? And that varies so much from day to day that I have a hard time answering. Sometimes I'm on the courthouse steps of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, bringing a case for judges to decide on the future of salmon management. And sometimes I'm trying to document a single steelhead, endangered steelhead in a stream to provide it more protections. So the mission of the Wild Fish Conservancy is to preserve, protect, and restore the Northwest wild fish and the ecosystems they depend on through science, education, and advocacy. We're a nonprofit conservation organization based in Duval. And our client through that organization, we don't work for an interest group. We're not a recreational fishing advocacy organization. We don't work for commercial fishers. Our client really is the fish society and future generations. So just to start out here, I wanted to share a few stories about interconnectedness in the stream environment, just because I think it's important to set the stage on the ways in which species are linked to one another. And so shown above is a developing elvin. Its egg sac is still visible outside of its body, and a streamside flower. This is kneeling angelica covered in black flies. And so when I was working in Alaska, a friend of mine, Pete Lisi, noticed streams right next to one another, flowing into the same lake, literally with the mouths of those creeks, a matter of a couple hundred yards from one another, had vastly different timings in when the flowers bloomed. And so as it turns out, and after Pete did his graduate study on this, it was determined that the temperature of the stream and the rate at which salmon eggs incubate was what led to the difference of those flowers blooming at different times. The temperature controls how quickly embryos develop when they're in the gravel. And when those embryos go out to the ocean, come back, those adults decide when to spawn based on that water temperature. And the pollinators, those blowflies, they timed their emergence to be able to take advantage of the decomposing adult salmon after they spawned. And so it's just, in essence, the relationship between salmon, insects, and flowers was so intricately interwoven with the environment that the water temperature between 2 neighboring streams was what led to the difference. So here, again, another story of interconnectedness. Here's a full-length coated wire tag, as well as a pit tag. You can see they're just a matter of millimeters long. And they're put into juvenile fish to track their migrations in rivers like the Columbia. They're often used to track downstream survival through dams and adult survival. But there was a really curious story in which someone who was studying sooty shearwaters in New Zealand, which is a seabird that comes and forages off the Oregon coast, um, they found when they were looking at the chicks in their nest that there was a pit tag, and that pit tag was consumed by an adult shearwater that probably regurgitated that tag to its chick when it was feeding it. That was from the Columbia River. So I talk about this story of interconnectedness because the actions we take here locally to protect, preserve, and restore our wild fish do literally ripple across oceans and across hemispheres. Another quick example here, here's some Oregon coast steelhead, three adult males and three females. It's actually 6 fish total in this photo. Have also been known to make large migrations. One of those tags was also found all the way across the Pacific off the coast of Japan in the Mariana Trench. And so, again, I just want to emphasize the decisions we make here locally are rippling throughout this web of interconnected relationships all across the coast. And I can't stress how importantly enough it is to use salmon as an indicator of health, not just for the fish, but for the ecosystem as a whole. Researchers have been studying rivers and fish for a long time, and one study I wanted to highlight was done by a collaboration between US and Japanese scientists. And what they did is they used a net to disconnect the stream habitat from the surrounding terrestrial ecosystem. So they essentially made like a greenhouse with netting across it to prevent the movement of resources between each environment. And what they found was astonishing, almost 50% reduction in biomass in the stream, as well as in key metrics in the forest. Things like spiders, 50% of them disappeared after they put up that net, and 50% of the fish disappeared. Fish unable to feed on the terrestrial insects that came and were blown into the stream by the wind have forced those fish to overfeed on the aquatic species to the point of collapse. So cutting off that relationship between ecosystems really diminishes each of them respectively. It's important not to think of them as separate environments, but really as one integrated ecosystem where there are relationships and fluxes that happen all the time. And salmon have been studied through tree rings. Their abundance has been looked at through lake cores, which allows you to determine salmon over thousands of years. Tree rings here over hundreds of years, and commercial fisheries landings. One of the common measures is stable isotopes and the metric of nitrogen that is brought in from the ocean and put into the ecosystem through the decomposition of adult salmon and mycelium that take that nitrogen through the soil. Here's a graph that looks at over the last 120 years what those trends look like for coho salmon, which were really one of the first salmon species to catalyze the restoration movement and salmon recovery efforts that have been taking place over the last 25 to 30 years. Jim Likotowicz, who recently passed away, a mentor and really a thought leader, author of Salmon Without Rivers and Salmon People Place, he had a quote that I think is really poignant, and that is, animals don't go extinct because we shoot the last one or a bulldozer scrapes away all of the last of the habitat. They go extinct because the web of relationships that sustain them unravel. And I've been thinking a lot about Jim as certain events have been unfolding. We'll come back to some of his thoughts. He just was a wonderful thinker, especially on the conceptual foundations we bring to environmental problem solving. That was really inspiring. So here we have a juvenile coho salmon, and like I mentioned in the prior slide on the work in Japan, they rely not just on the stream environment. For a period of several weeks in the summer, they rely almost exclusively on terrestrial insects for food. And so similar to that experiment, when forests are cut down or biodiversity is reduced, their survival also decreases. In the late 90s, when we were trying to unravel the listing of coho, people assumed that almost all of the juveniles existed in the stream. And there was a life history that was really discovered by research by Dan Bottom and Kim Jones in the Salmon River Estuary, which was termed the nomad life history, where you have these juveniles that go out to the estuary and rear there. There was a researcher that worked for the National Marine Fisheries Service that did an estimate on what the carrying capacity of some of these estuaries were, and they were getting numbers into the millions. And I bring this up because that overwinter survival study that I was a part of, snorkeling for juvenile to determine how many of them were making it through the winter in these freshwater environments, didn't consider any of that information when developing the harvest models for how many fish needed to come back to produce the next generation. Diversity was an element that was ignored, while the production model, how do we get back the most fish out of this this commoditized maximum sustained yield mental frame. That's how fisheries models were run and harvest decisions were made. And it got us into a lot of trouble. Here's a photo of some estuary restoration. Many of you may be familiar with it. It's just on the Siletz National Wildlife Refuge and took place this last summer. Those nomad coho that are going to rear in this newly established habitat, none of that is being incorporated into the harvest management models of how many adult coho we need to return to reach not just delisting, which is what most people's goal is to accomplish, but broad sense recovery, getting back up to the millions of salmon, which we know is possible from seeing watersheds to the north of us. So last I counted, there's been over $150 million spent on habitat restoration. Yet many of the key metrics, such as the quantity of large woody debris, remain static. And that's to say a lot of the restoration we're doing is keeping pace with the degradation that's still taking place. And so one of the things I've focused on my life and work is the science policy interface and how we rebuild some of those habitats and rework those harvest models over time. This is a figure. It's actually from a publication that Jim Likatowicz, Rick Williams, Bill Bakke, Jim Myron, and Bill McMillan, Jack Stanford, David Montgomery put out. If you haven't seen it, it's called Wild Pacific Salmon, A Threatened Legacy. I highly recommend it for anyone who has not seen it to go through. And this is a waterfall graph. That previous graph I showed you on coho salmon really only took place over the last 150 years. Salmon have been hugely abundant for a long period of time. Going back 5,000 years before present, salmon really reached their max after the last ice age kind of retreated and populations established themselves throughout the Pacific coast. And so really focusing in on that, the last 150 years and what's changed, is part of the work that we need to do. And that concept of what shifting baselines is what I really want to come back to for a second. This is Cutler City. Many of you are probably familiar with it, right at the mouth of Siletz Bay. I was reading in some of the Historical Society's documents that the streets of Cutler City are paved with the gravel that was mined from the Siletz estuary. And that really struck me. You know, this is a 1945 image of the development of the estuary. You can see a big logging camp. See if I can use my cursor here. And you can see in this, oh, let me just try to get my, there we go. You can see in this slough here, it's filled with logs that are about ready to be milled at the mill here. There was a fishing cannery located up here, and a lot of that gravel was taken out of this area. When you go back and read some of the Lincoln County lore and through the Talbot expedition that I was talking about in 1849, you read things like this that really stop you in your tracks. And it was returning down the river. We stopped at some Indian lodges where we had great abundance of a very excellent little fish, some resembling a sardine in appearance, but larger. What we've found is in many of the rivers of the northwest part of this coast and known by many the name of hooligan. They take them here in weirs with large scoops. And when you look to the rivers of the Oregon coast, you don't see eulachon running up them anymore. They spawn in those fine gravels in lower river reaches that were likely mined out and on the now exist on the streets of Cutler City. The sediment that is replacing those is not necessarily suitable spawning habitat. And while there still remains a few remnant populations that I know of down in the 10-mile area of eulachon, very, very few individuals exist. I've never seen one in all my years spending underwater in the Oregon coast. And that brings me to some of the different mental models I wanted to talk about. There are three very different categories of environmental problems. One is like a rubber band. You can stretch it out and let go, and it will go back. Another one is like a broken bone, and you can break your leg, or both legs in this case, and they will heal over time, but they may not be the same. And then you have environmental problems that are like broken eggs, or as a good friend of mine, Rowan Baker, who introduced me to this mental model, said is the Humpty Dumpty environmental problems. This is a picture of a recent clear cut on unstable slope in the headwaters of the Siletz. You can see water coming down. You know, people assume that these forests will grow back, but some of these landslides that carry sediment down into these streams could be more like broken bone problems. And when you hear of deforestation, you know, the other thing that's really become apparent recently is not in the terrestrial environment, but the ocean environment. Nearly 900 acres of bull kelp forest has essentially disappeared off the Oregon coast since 2010, and only around 1/3 of Oregon's kelp forests remain. These could be stretching into broken bone or maybe even Humpty Dumpty problems where you have compounding environmental stressors that are adding up to something much greater than the part of themselves. Here's a photo of some of the herring populations. You know, there's only one known herring spawning location off the Oregon coast in Yaquina Bay now, and they rely heavily on the kelp forest ecosystem when they're growing. This is just near Boiler Bay just a few years ago, young of the year herring growing up there. Which leads me to a much larger conversation. You know, the climate is shifting This is a model that the um, USGS has helped put together. It's the Northwest Stream Temperature Model. It shows the predicted stream temperatures in 2080. And in many parts of the Willamette, temperatures are becoming unlivable to salmon. They're having to seek out refuge in cold water environments. And but you can also notice that there's a patch of cold water up above Lincoln City, which may act as a climate refuge zone. I wanted to mention climate change too, because it's not necessarily just the hot, warm effect that I think is important to pay attention to. And if I can see this plays okay. Here we have some Oregon coast coho and a few Chinook in the stream in the late fall. I think this is in December, just a few years ago. And something I want you to notice, you can see it here on the fins. There's some here up on this fish as well. There's a bunch of river leeches that have attached on to those fish. And those leeches carry a disease called cryptobia that was linked to changing stream flows. So not getting enough high water in the fall that flushes out all of the leaf litter and detritus causes those leeches to really boom in population, and almost every salmon was getting infested by them. That cryptobia was causing pre-spawn mortality, and hundreds of salmon were dying off before they were able to spawn. So again, that's a climate change impact that's coming at us in the Oregon coast region that we've never seen before, and wasn't just a consequence of hot weather in the summertime. Coming back to Oregon coast coho, just because that's really what I grew up with. When I was 5 years old, they were just listed for the first time, and that was a big thought for a little kid to try and understand. Um, the Oregon coast coho is listed as a evolutionarily significant unit, or those coho are related enough to each other that if you lose those populations, that you lose a important evolutionary legacy of the species as a whole. And unlike many other ESUs, such as Puget Sound or coho in the lower Columbia, there were two major actions. They curtailed hatchery production and substantially reduced harvest fisheries in the ocean. Afterwards, looking back at some of those actions, over the course of time, we've removed barriers, and stream habitat has been put back together through the introduction of large woody debris. Here you can see the North Creek culvert, a tributary to Drift Creek, which was fixed in 2019, and that first year, coho and Chinook were spawning above that site. Fish passage has been fixed, and log jams have been formed. Here is a log jam that was built by flying these logs in with a Chinook helicopter into Salmon Creek, which is located just by Drift Creek Falls trailhead. And those log jams were built because in many cases, the Fish and Wildlife Service in the past, they believed that log jams were blocking salmon, and they put out Fish and Wildlife staff with chainsaws and walked up streams and cut them apart, because they believed that was one of the biggest problems limiting salmon populations. Even still, as coho were listed, riparian protections were put in place that were very narrow. The common frame that people worked under is that these large logs fell in from the surrounding stream environment. There's really narrow strips of the riparian zone, and that's how these large log jams were formed. Here you can see a large Sitka spruce along on the left before it fell, on the right after it fell. But even in a stream this size, that 300-year-old spruce did not stay put and form a log jam where it fell. As it turns out, this is one of the main factors for what forms salmon habitat. It's debris torrents on forested slopes, or landslides coming down areas on unstable slopes where you have large complex forested environment entering the stream all at once. And to compare that to what exists on a lot of the landscape now, a lot of these upslope areas were never protected. They were cut over, and these debris torrents bring mostly sediment into the streams. Most recently, through the private forest accord, there's been new models that have been developed to help address this issue. Again, it's not putting sticks in cricks, as it's called, in some of the restoration communities with helicopters. It's protecting the natural process that allows those habitats to form in the first place. Here, I've provided a slide, which is the modeled debris torrent paths, and you can use them for forest planning. You can protect those areas. In the new private forest accord, they call them gummy worms, and they have to make sure enough of them are protected on the landscape, so future landslides will bring these um, large woody debris back into coho habitat. Just to make sure everyone's seeing this, the red areas here are like this are the areas of high landslide hazard or debris torrent hazard zones, and the blue areas are areas of low landslide hazard. So by protecting these gummy worms, as they're called, you're able to get more, up to 50% more wood that enters the stream over time. This is an example of what a legacy debris torrent looks like. It crosses the whole stream, retains gravel behind it, cleans water. So below these kinds of features, which is taken in the old growth habitat of the Siuslaw National Forest, you get gravel that looks like this, which is clean of sediment. There are large cobbles that have interstitial spaces in between them that allows water to flow between the rocks and the stream, and allowing for an exchange of groundwater to surface water, which is what helps keep that stream cool. It's not just the shade of trees preventing the sun from reaching the water, but it is really the interplay between groundwater and surface water over complex stream and floodplain habitats that keeps water cool throughout the summer. And it also has the opposite effect. It buffers cold water in the wintertime, effectively allowing juvenile fish a longer active growing season. When people say they want cold, clean water, that's often not the case in January. If you have warmer water, all the fish will be concentrated in those warmer areas. And here's a picture of what happens when you don't protect those areas that are known debris torrent risks. This, obviously, there's an interaction between the road runoff and that area of high landslide risk, or high landslide hazard zones, as they're called in the speak of the Oregon Department of Forestry. This is what contributes sediment to our streams and is causing the water quality to be sediment listed under the 303D list and the Clean Water Act. This is what you see in a lot of the industrial timberlands, as they're known, where logging has hugely impacted not just the immediate stream environment, but everything downstream of there. So a study was done in the Drift Creek watershed looking at drinking water source protections. And what they found is that annual soil loss over a 30-year period was estimated to be 27 tons per acre per year. The average soil loss in 2016 was estimated at 28 tons per acre per year, which is about the same. So that's almost 2.5 dump trucks of sediment per acre per year being contributed to the watershed by some of these forest practices, and clear cuts were the main culprit and the bulk of that contribution. This is what that looks like underwater. Again, conversely to the clean gravels we saw below the healthy debris torrents, which clean the water. Here you can see sediment clogging those interstitial spaces between the rocks, preventing the groundwater to surface water interaction, and really degrading habitat all through national forest land, which is protected. So one of the quotes from the 303D listing of the stream is suspected sediment influxes of unknown origin are changing the ecology of watershed by stressing fish habitat through increased turbidity, increasing conductivity, increasing temperature, reducing stream flow, decreasing dissolved oxygen concentrations. So I'm going to change gears here a little bit because it's not just the rural or forested landscapes where we're running into problems with salmon habitat. Pictured here on the right is someone I mentioned earlier. His name is Bill McMillan, and someone I've really looked up to my entire life. He walked streams with the Wild Fish Conservancy in the Puget Sound region and noticed over 2 decades ago, pre-spawn mortality happening. Similar to the stories I was telling about Cryptobia, Bill was trying to figure out what was causing all these fish to die before they spawned. And it took almost 20 years to solve that mystery. And just recently, through a collaboration between Wild Fish Conservancy, the EPA, and many different groups trying to research and distill what might be causing this, it was determined that it was stormwater. And not just kind of general stormwater, but there was a very specific compound, and it turned out to be a compound called 6-PPD. It comes out of tires. It's a rubber preservative, and it is incredibly toxic to fish. What inspires me most about this story is the dedication that people put in to try to solve this mystery. Turns out that the best predictor of pre-spawn mortality in this region, going back a few slides, is the percentage of the watershed that is in impervious surfaces. And so some of the tribal partners just petitioned the EPA, and they have started to undergo considering rulemaking on limiting the use of this rubber preservative in tires. But it is tire dust. You know, we all use cars and transportation, and this effect is very prevalent. But what inspires me is that through this research and advocacy, tire companies are now looking into alternative preservatives that don't have the same effect. And it is inspiring innovation, and people are motivated to solve this problem. So I've talked a lot about habitat, and I'm going to try to just provide a little more context, because habitat certainly is not is certainly a problem, but it's certainly not the only problem revolving around salmon recovery. And you know, when I explore salmon habitat, one of the things that really strikes me is how much empty habitat there really is. Spawning gravels that go unused, or juvenile rearing areas that are not being used. And that points you in a very different direction. In the Columbia, there was a paper that came out just last year that despite $9 billion on restoration, they found no empirical evidence of an increase in wild fish abundance associated with restoration spending. And that's a really scary thing to think about. You know, there is more money spent on salmon than any other endangered species, and more money is spent in the Columbia Basin than just about any other watershed. And to say that habitat restoration over the past 3+ decades has not increased wild fish abundance should be a red flag to everyone. Something else I just wanted to bring to attention and kind of shift our thinking a little bit. The size of Chinook in 1920 in many of the ocean fisheries was over 20 pounds. 1960, 15 pounds. And by 1975, they were shrunk to almost 10 pounds. Just recently in the Alaska troll fishery, they dipped below 10 pounds for the first time. And that's a big difference compared to this picture, which I'm sure many of you have seen, of the 100+ pound salmon that used to return to the Columbia. Those salmon spawn in gravels the size of softballs and volleyballs. And when they're unable to turn over those gravels because they're too small, that habitat effectively goes unutilized. Fishing in the ocean has created new management changes. You know, remember that waterfall graph where we really looked at the last 150 years and this huge dip in salmon abundance, and across many of the species showed the same trend. The Pacific Salmon Treaty is what really guides a lot of this. Coho don't travel as far offshore, but especially Oregon coast Chinook do these large oceanward migrations. And you have healthy populations of Chinook mixed in with threatened and endangered populations of Chinook. For example, the Willamette Chinook, all going to the same places in the ocean. Here's the Gulf of Alaska, and you can see populations from southeast go out onto the coast. The north coast of BC goes in that area, west coast of Vancouver Island. All of these different Chinook populations go and mix in this rearing zone off of the Gulf of Alaska, off of southeast Alaska. And that leads to this conundrum. You know, most fishers have the greatest intentions for conservation. The fishers are some of the people who care most about the resource, and shouldn't be blamed whatsoever for this problem. But as today's fisheries are managed, anywhere a fisher pulls their line in this area are destined to catch a mixture of stocks, many of which are threatened or endangered. Doesn't matter if it's here, or here. You have a chance of encountering any number of those populations from the entire Pacific coast. This is what we call the mixed stock fishing dilemma. The open ocean fisheries in these locations are what are known as mixed stock fisheries. And they fish on all these different populations, from the Oregon coast all the way up into Alaska. They harvest fish from any river of origin. They cannot separate out healthy and endangered fish, like I said. They cannot separate out hatchery fish from wild fish. And they cannot separate out immature fish from fully grown fish. And what I mean by that is salmon like Chinook, they'll spend multiple years out in the ocean. And so if they're caught as a 9-pound Chinook, you don't know if that Chinook would have stayed 2 or 3 more years and grown to be a 40, 50, 60-pound Chinook when you're catching it, as opposed to a terminal fishery, which is always fishing on mature fish that are returning to spawn in their rivers of origin. And in the process, they're removed from the food chain of other species that depend on them near their home waters. So the Southeast Alaska mixed stock fishery, this is data from the Genetic Stock ID, or GSI. They use genetics to determine where the Chinook originate from. And these are marketed in the grocery store as Alaskan caught Chinook salmon. You can see a huge number of them are from the Columbia River. A large number of them are from the Oregon coast and Washington coast. Some of them are from Puget Sound and the Fraser and the BC coast. and a very, very small fraction of them, sometimes as low as 3% of them, are actually from Alaska. And that is also to say, most of them that they are catching are considered threatened or endangered. Here's some pie graphs for other fisheries. You can see the BC coastal fishery also is a huge interception mixed stock fishery that primarily targets Columbia River and Oregon and Washington coast fish. And a lot of people have identified this problem, but we're just beginning to start to put together models about what the effects of this are. My colleague Nick Gajewski has this paper, which is in press and under peer review at the moment, looking at just how much of the ocean fisheries are contributing to the shrinking size of Chinook. Remember, the longer you stay in the ocean, the more you're exposed to those mixed stock fisheries. And over evolutionary time, the fish that stay out the least are the ones that survive the best. And so it encourages smaller age and maturity for Chinook over time. And it predicts the effect of this management almost perfectly over the time period. What is amazing is, and I don't want to give away the punchline here, but by moving into terminal fisheries, you can reverse a lot of this effect. NGOs, businesses, and coastal communities are all starting to rise up, especially with the catalyzing event of the southern resident killer whales not getting enough Chinook salmon. I'm sure some of you have probably heard another calf unfortunately didn't make it just over the end of year holiday. And these moments demand us to rethink the frameworks in which we understand salmon management need to take place under. So we're just beginning to launch a Let Our Salmon Come Home campaign. There's a lot that is behind this. I don't have time to go into it all tonight. I'm sure I'm already going low on time. So I just wanted to pitch, if you want to have a presentation on this campaign exclusively, I'm happy to give one. We can dig into what's happening, some more of the specifics and the data behind some of this decision maker, and begin to unite the communities that all depend on fish returning and who have invested the most in salmon recovery. We've led successful grassroots advocacy campaigns, such as just yesterday, finally abolishing commercial net pen aquaculture in Washington State. Shout out to Emma Helverson for leading that. And I think this is possibly the next big thing to help realize what's possible and take advantage of all this work that we've put into restoring our habitats. You know, in some cases, over 50% of the salmon that would return to the Oregon coast are taken in ocean fisheries before they're allowed to return. This is not a new idea. You know, this is a figure comparing indigenous and contemporary fisheries management systems and how decision-making and authority is distributed in each system. Will Atlas, a friend of mine, has published with some of our other Wild Fish Conservancy staff on this. It's a really foundational paper that I would encourage you all to read. And moving these large-scale industrial mixed stock ocean fisheries into terminal fisheries where local communities have more control over them is really, it's not a new model. It's something that happened prior to that waterfall graph that I showed you. And the prior to 150 years ago, this was the system of management that communities used to live with salmon. Here's a couple contrasting images. The dipnet fishery of Willamette Falls, the Grand Ronde tribe, has been operating the last few years, and a traditional fish weir that was operated near the turn of the century. We're also innovating. This is my colleague Adrian Tui, who's assessing the survival of salmon. Remember, In many of these fisheries, you're encountering endangered fish alongside fish that are intended for harvest, be them hatchery fish or relatively healthy stocks of salmon. These fish traps and weirs are tools in which allow you to effectively release the threatened fish unharmed, and keep those fish which are targeted for harvest. We have several of these fish traps now operating in the Columbia, and these terminal fisheries are really starting to gain steam up and down the entire Pacific coast. So that's a lot of different stories. I touched on some of the local habitat restoration efforts and the environmental problems that we're still experiencing. And a friend of mine, Trygve Steen, asked this question: what is the root of all environmental problems? And I think it's an important thing to think about because, like Likatowicz said in that first quote that I provided, we're trying to understand conceptual models, and we've developed a management paradigm of the salmon species through a lens of commoditization. And this leads to these problems of arrogance, ignorance, and greed. I was speaking with Trygve, and he said that these three factors very insidiously interact with one another to degrade many of the places and relationships in that kind of woven network of how species interact with one another over time. And as I think about what the antidotes might be, especially as it relates to the legacy that we want to leave, the three words that came to mind were humility, awareness, and generosity. And to end the presentation, I just wanted to highlight a few individuals and stories and species that I think embody that idea. This is Bill Peterson. He passed away a few years ago of cancer, but his dedication to studying ocean conditions off the coast of Oregon helped shed light on these problems of the blob showing up and wiping out huge proportions of salmon in the North Pacific. He dedicated himself to studying the plankton and the zooplankton and phytoplankton off the Newport trawl. And really, I think in the presentations he's given over the years, and as he saw those ocean cycles start to break down at the end of his life, expressed a huge amount of humility in admitting he did not have the answers. I think his example leads us to really question whether or not the salmon models that we've developed will continue to serve us in the future, and invites us to develop new ones. And then awareness. One of the things that's really scary to me is when I show up to a favorite section of my stream and there's freshly put down gravel on a road. Things have been, the sides of the roads have been cleared, and it looks like there'll be a clear cut. I finally got sick of not really knowing what was going on, so I signed up for FERNS, or the Forestry Notification System that the Oregon Department of Forestry operates. And for the watersheds that I've really come to care about, I now get notified in advance of any planned operation. And for some of these operations, I've been able to modify or in a couple cases stop habitats from being destroyed. That awareness is also something that personally I've been working on to try to share, because it's not just a single individual's awareness that can really make a big difference over time, but it's through events like these, sharing information over time and space through larger communities of people, that real change can start to be affected. So I encourage everyone to help build awareness of the problems and articulate often what the solution to them as well. And then lastly, this is the story of the freshwater mussel, just because I think they're so amazing. Coho salmon, just as a little side story, they have this relationship with freshwater mussels where they help distribute the young by swimming around. Um, but freshwater mussels filter a huge amount of water. Here you can see the actual filtering mechanism inside of the freshwater mussel that helps clean those streams of sediment and provides us clean water to drink. So in the last of those three antidotes to greed, ignorance, and arrogance, generosity, I'm really thankful for the freshwater mussels and all they do to help clean the water for the myriad of species that depend on them. So to wrap things up, I'll leave that with questions.
All right, we have a good number of questions, and thanks everybody who submitted. The first one, and I'll just say we'll try to get through all of these. We still have about 27 minutes left in our session, so hopefully we can get through all of these. Our first question is very timely. Washington DNR voted yesterday to ban all commercial fish pen operations in Washington coastal waters. Good news for so many of us to hear. I assume it puts us more in line with Oregon and California, though I hear there are still at least some Columbia River net pen operations. Can you speak to your actions at Wild Fish Conservancy regarding this subject? Seems like BC and Canadian waters have not moved this direction. How does this affect the greater Northwest salmon population?
That's a big that is a big question. Yes, there was big news yesterday from DNR. That's a campaign we've been working on since 2018, and yes, there are still some net pen operations in the Upper Columbia. Those are operated by a tribe, and this effort does not ban the tribal operation of net pens. It is an action that prevents the Department of Natural Resource for leasing the seabed for that purpose. So while there are still farmed, and they call them steelhead, I think they're really farming rainbow trout up there since those fish never get to see the ocean. But that is one of the few examples of finfish aquaculture left in the state. I think there were a couple more parts of that question. Did I miss anything?
Can you speak to your actions at Wild Fish Conservancy? I think you already covered that. Seems like, or I guess, how does British Columbia and Canadian waters not moving this direction affect the greater Northwest salmon population?
You know, BC has actually been moving in the right direction. They've been pushing back their total ban on finfish aquaculture numerous times, but a substantial number of net pens have been removed over time. And I would encourage anyone to follow Alexandra Morton's work because she has seen a resurgence in wild salmon populations and also a huge reduction in sea lice. When I am snorkeling off the Oregon coast, I see many sea lice on our herring, and I wonder, where are they coming from? What's causing sea lice? Are those sea lice inhibiting herring from rebounding across our coast? So I wouldn't say Canada is not making progress. They're certainly more slow to transition. They're supposed to transition to land-based aquaculture over a time period. They did not meet that timeline and have now backtracked and are maybe trying to permit closed containment aquaculture, which is still in the ocean, but not open nets where pollution and disease can flow back and forth. But there's a lot of colleagues that we work with up in BC to work on that issue. So stay tuned on that one. We're not giving up just from our most recent action with DNR. One thing I also mention, because we often use public records requests, and one thing that was really concerning to us is we did a public records request from a virus that we noted in some of these BC farms to see if it showed up in any of the state of Washington's or Oregon's fish hatchery operations. And it is showing up. It looks like some of the viruses that were imported from Europe via Atlantic salmon eggs escaped into the aquaculture and fish culture of Pacific Northwest salmon and are currently being amplified through state-run and federally run fish hatcheries. So it's a huge concern, and I'm glad that we banned the practice to stop the importation, and now there's still more work to be done in cleaning up after that industry, which has caused an immense amount of harm.
Great, thank you. Joseph Yorn asks, why have Yulkan as a species not been addressed under the Endangered Species Act?
You know, Ulicon were petitioned for listing, and I hate to say that I don't know, but I think they might have some protections. I know that there is a management plan in the Columbia for the one or two populations. You know, they still exist in the Cowlitz and the Sandy River in Oregon. And the last few years have seen huge returns of Ulicon that were absent for over 2 decades. They've had to shut down, and then all of a sudden they showed up. That's what one of the photos that I showed was from. What's a photo I took in the, or actually my friend David Simchuk took in the Sandy River just last year. So, Joe, I'll follow up with you on that. I have a management plan. I can't remember if it's a joint state wildlife plan or if there is some ESA protections. But I think what's noteworthy is the shifting baselines have acted so strongly that there's no ambition to meaningfully try to reintroduce them or bring them back to places we knew they existed, like the smaller rivers of the Oregon coast. And they're not actively being integrated into habitat restoration efforts or management planning. Forage fish have a huge effect on salmon populations, so I think it's a real missed opportunity that deserves some more attention.
Great. From Jay Godfrey, how do the leeches that you spoke of earlier affect the southern resident killer whales if they ingest a salmon with leeches?
So those leeches I showed you some video of, they're just freshwater leeches. They don't go out into the ocean. They're not on the salmon when they would be um, um, eaten by the southern residents or other marine mammals for that fact. But what they do have the effect of is that introducing cryptobia, which is that disease I mentioned that lives in their host is the leech, and they introduce it to the salmon. Cryptobia causes pre-spawn mortality, and you know, in the case a few years ago on the North Oregon coast, they were recovering hundreds of dead adult salmon that died before they had a chance to spawn. And so when those kinds of pre-spawn mortality events occur, you're not taking advantage of the full habitat if you don't have enough adult salmon to reproduce. And that low abundance of Chinook is really one of the key factors that's impacting the southern residents right now. So that's indirectly they're affecting the southern residents, not directly through any problem with the river leeches.
Great, thanks for that clarification. Let's see, Terry Wright asks, do riparian buffers work? Isn't it better to leave forests intact instead of 50-foot buffers along streams? I've seen photos of streams blocked by mudflows and landslides due to clear cuts outside of the buffer zones.
I have to agree with that comment. You know, I think buffers, you know, it's often hotly debated in forestry operations what the size of the buffers should be, but certainly protecting forests is more important than just an ecosystem function. You know, to me, it's not just forests or buffers in a conversation. You know, there's a lot of concern that I have around monoculture plantations of a single species that don't have the biodiversity from the forests that were being cut down. I showed that photo of the hill slope that had been clear cut after I was notified about it. And they were cutting down a legacy forest that had grown back naturally after it was cut the first time. And they're replacing it with mostly a monoculture of Doug fir, not a mixed stand of hemlock and spruce and fir and cedar and maple and alder. And you know, again, it's that conceptual foundation of commoditization. I think that's the real challenge. Arguing over buffer widths, certainly bigger buffers are better, but it's not the only thing to focus on.
Paul Engelmeyer says, great talk. Can you talk about the issues about the value of beavers in our watersheds and estuaries?
Yeah, I didn't. Paul, it's good to see your name up there. I didn't have enough room to weave beavers into this talk, but certainly, what beavers do is they raise water levels in engaged floodplains. So in highly incised streams, they can exponentially increase the amount of salmon habitat. Um, just in terms of how much water they retain in the floodplain can be huge. When I was up in Alaska, I would see these rivers. I saw a beaver dam that was 15 feet tall and probably 400 to 500 feet long. That was impounding a huge lake that provided an immense amount of habitat for salmon. And these river valleys were just these complexes of lakes. It wasn't just a single river flowing down the middle, like I think most people in the Northwest are accustomed to. It was this huge complex of valley-wide lakes and wetlands that were created by beavers. So when I talk about the shifting baselines, beavers are another prime example of how that impacts salmon. So certainly the restoration and protection of beavers goes hand in hand. Again, like Jim Likatowicz said, it's the web of interwoven relationships and disconnection that causes species to go extinct. So the opposite is also true. To restore salmon, you need to restore beavers.
Heather, can I just get a quick time check on how much we have left for the Q&A?
Yeah, I would say probably about 10, 11 more minutes.
Great, plenty of time. We have a couple of comments, accolades to you, Conrad. I'm gonna skip past. So Adam Bronstein asks, what are some differences and similarities between how Oregon and Washington are managing their wild cold water fisheries?
Oh, that's a big question. One of the things that I've been really disconcerted about in Washington, that's really played into some of that mixed stock fishing in Alaska is Washington, in order to try and provide more food for the Southern residents, did not want to look at their fisheries. They decided instead to increase Chinook salmon hatchery production to try and solve that problem without kind of taking the hard look at whether putting more hatchery fish out would just increase fisheries and provide the same number of salmon back to the Southern residents. Oregon decided to largely not participate in that Orca Prey initiative process and instead focus efforts more on habitat restoration, dam removal, those kinds of things. So I've seen a fairly stark difference in approaches to how they're trying to solve that problem. And obviously by the example of the most recent calf fatality, that hatchery fix isn't working. It hasn't worked for 150 years to mitigate the loss of salmon. And I hate that term mitigation because it really, you don't replace the relationships that salmon have with all the species by just simply producing more of them in a factory and releasing them. So I've noticed that that Washington has taken a more aggressive stance in that. Oregon, I think sometimes people think the grass is always greener on each side of the state border. Being someone that works on both sides of the Columbia, Washington has been much more receptive to developing fish trap fisheries or terminal fisheries based on fish traps than Oregon has. And they improved many of their forest practices long before Oregon did. Just recently, Oregon has really kind of come up to the Washington standard for forest practices. The other thing that I would say that Washington has done well is with their water typing rules. Water typing is the process by which you determine what kind of fish exist in a waterway and what kind of protections it's afforded. My colleague Jamie Glasgow has really done a ton of that. A lot of that water typing work has protected huge amounts of stream in Washington State. And some cases you go into watersheds and map with the latest LiDAR technology where a stream exists, and you're adding 50% more stream habitat. Oregon's been a little slower to adopt that. In the most recent forest revisions, they're just starting to get into water typing. But I guess that's a little bit of some of the differences and benefits and drawbacks I've seen of each state just off the top of my head.
Sorry, forgot I was muted. With all the science presented, how can the U.S. Forest Service permit any of these slope clear cuts?
The Forest Service has protections to the Northwest Forest Plan. Some of those may be changed through the new process. There was a big research study done after the floods of the mid to late 90s on where landslides were occurring. And some of these models that we've developed, like the slope hazard model that we shared, are now available and able to be used. So I would say following the science on predicting where those are going to occur and making sure that any sort of active management is not going to take place around them is the best way to make sure you're not causing debris torrents through logging. Now, the other major factor there is road building, because what I've also seen on Forest Service lands is a lack of road maintenance, and in some case, road reconstruction over unstable slopes without any sort of environmental review. And so those two factors are really important to consider for the long run. There's huge amounts of road system within the national forest that are often under-maintained. So even just one plugged culvert above an area that's unstable can cause a landslide and an immense amount of damage. And remember, growing big trees is also really important for stopping some of these events. 500-year-old trees can stop small debris torrents in valley bottoms. Small trees snap when you get those big, powerful events that come down. So some of it is just prioritizing, maintaining habitats that can withstand those kinds of pressures as well, because there are natural slides, and we do want them to contribute large wood and gravel to the streams when they occur in a healthy manner. But it's just the frequency and the magnitude in which is unhealthy right now. Just to come back to Joseph's question really quick, I did see someone looked up that Yulikan are ESA listed. Now, I don't think that's along the Oregon coast. I think that's just in the Columbia. But yeah, Joseph, just to close the circle on that question, thanks for the anonymous person who found the link.
Thanks, Anonymous. So this might be a good place for us to wrap up. Denise Wirtz asks, thank you for your hard work. Well, states, thank you for your hard work, and asks, what organization should we join and support?
Oh, man. Well, obviously, all the ones that you see here today. I think as you follow different groups, you'll kind of see where their niche is. In environmental nonprofits, there's always politics, but I've really seen the benefit of large coalition building over time to make huge change. The Washington net pen issue was a prime example of that. And it's not just organizations either, also businesses, especially businesses that are willing to stick up for what they believe is right environmentally, should be supported. So I think Nissa and or Heather are going to put a link to our Wildfish Conservancy Take Action in the chat, just so people can learn a little bit more about the group I work for now. But certainly find and support the community of environmental advocates and how they organize locally, and then work out from there. Certainly there are regional groups. I would also just encourage people to seek out those groups that do the hard political and advocacy work, because they're few and far between, and they need all the support they can get. Often they're not considered in kind of general granting processes because people don't want to tackle those big mixed stock ocean issues, for example. But I would encourage, for those who are interested, to think about the advocacy organizations that do that hard political work.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Conrad, for your beautiful presentation. And also, it was very, very informative and very inspiring. I definitely learned a lot. I always think I know about salmon and then I learned something new. So thanks for that.
Yeah.
And I think Nissa was going to add that to the chat. That
there's
link to.
not a great public facing chat for me to put that in, but I will make sure to link that take action or action alert page that you mentioned, Conrad, in the follow-up email that I send to all of the people who registered for our session today. So I'm the one who's been bugging you about with emails about reminders for today's webinar. So look for an email from me tomorrow or the next day that will contain that link.
Awesome.
There's one little thing that came in the chat at the end here. I think it's worth just acknowledging. And I did see that the old growth amendment was pulled by the Biden administration recently, or is going to be soon here. It is going to take communities of people banding together to support forest protection and watershed protection, salmon protection. I see this era as really no different than any other. And so I'm interested in all and everyone's ideas on how we continue to protect these important ecosystems and species. So thank you for that comment as well.
Yeah. Awesome. And if anyone's interested, we also have a lot of really good information on our website. We've got some take actions, things you can do, writing your congressman. So definitely check that out. And thank you all again for attending tonight. It was a great
Thanks,
turnout.
everyone.